Hello, from Ethiopian Satellite Television. This is Insight. Today on Insight, we will review Ethiopian-American relations with career diplomat Ambassador David Shinn. Ethiopia and the United States have had relations since the days of Emperor Menelik and President Theodore Roosevelt. Ethiopia has participated in the Korean War alongside the United States and also helped in the fight against terrorism. At one time, the American military had a base in Eritrea in the 1950s. So today, given that the President Biden has signed an executive order that imposes sanctions on Ethiopia, Eritrea, TPLF, and the Amhara regional government, Ambassador Shinn will help us understand what the U.S. intends to do and whether it can achieve those goals through these sanctions. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you, Ghazal. Happy to be with you again.
Okay, let me begin by saying, what is your evaluation of the executive order, and how optimistic are you that the different actors will adhere to the executive order?
I think it's important to understand what the executive order is and what it is not. I think there is some misunderstanding, particularly in the Ethiopian diaspora community, as to what it is. Basically, what it does is to lay the groundwork for potential sanctions against primarily individuals who are involved in the current conflict in northern Ethiopia. It doesn't actually sanction anyone, although it certainly lays down the potential to do that if certain conditions are not met. The sanctions, as I say, are aimed at individuals, also entities, which gets a little more confusing, but primarily individuals. And they're designed to try to do several things. One, encourage all parties to the conflict, including the TPLF, to start negotiating a solution to the differences that exist between the parties in conflict, and also to be sure that the northern Ethiopia is open for unfettered humanitarian access by the different organizations that are trying to resolve the humanitarian crisis in the area. So that's essentially what it is all about. As far as it's being able to have a major impact upon the current situation, I must say I can't be terribly optimistic. Certainly the initial reaction from Prime Minister Abiy was pretty strong in opposition to the executive order. I haven't seen anything since then that has changed that position from the side of the Ethiopian government. So it's a situation that I'm not optimistic about at the moment.
One at a time. Let's start from the negotiated ceasefire demand. As you know, the United States government under President Biden is not willing to accept, at least acknowledge, that the war was started by TPLF by attacking the Northern Command. The administration of President Trump did write to that effect. So meaning the United States government is asking a negotiation between a legitimate government and an armed belligerent, that is a non-state actor. Is that normal? How would you evaluate that idea?
I may be wrong on this, but my recollection is that that spokespersons for the U.S. government have acknowledged that the proximate outbreak of conflict between the Tigrayan forces on the one hand and the central government forces on the other was as a result of the attack on November 3 in Mekelle by the Tigrayans against the Northern Command. I believe that if you go back earlier in the record, that is clear.
Oh, okay, but TPLF is a belligerent group that has raised arms against a constitutional government. Why would the United States ask a duly elected government to negotiate with a belligerent group that is against the Constitution and the attacked federal forces? Is it normal practice to do that?
Yeah, actually it is, for one very simple reason. The other party to the dispute are the Tigrayan forces or the TPLF or a combination of both. And if you don't negotiate with them, who do you negotiate with? There is no one else out there on the other side to hold negotiations with. So for a very practical reason, putting aside the philosophical arguments, you either negotiate with the Tigrayan forces or you don't have a negotiation.
If you ask negotiation, wouldn't it be fair to accept, to demand, the United States government to demand that TPLF lay down its arms, and also for it to withdraw from the territory it has invaded so far?
Well, the U.S. government has asked the Tigrayans to depart from those parts of Amhara and Afar regions where they went after they succeeded in pushing out central government forces from central Tigray. And the U.S. government's on the record as having done that. And I think that is still U.S. government policy. Keep in mind, I don't speak for the U.S. government. I'm simply trying to interpret it for you. But I think it's clear that the U.S. is on record as asking for the Tigrayans to pull back, leave Amhara, leave Afar. They have not asked that they then lay down their arms. That would be probably suicidal from the standpoint of the Tigrayans. If they were to lay down arms, the central government would simply return with its armed forces in Tigray, and you would have a status quo situation, or status quo ante situation, where the central government would overrun all of Tigray again.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, as you know, there were 3 documents that were produced when the executive order was produced. It asked a lot of questions of the government, like providing essential services, electricity and internet to Tigray. It asks the unfettered access to those who are in need, but it never asked TPLF to vacate or withdraw from the areas it invaded. It never asked the TPLF to bring to justice or to hand over the leaders of the mutiny that attacked the Northern Command. So all the demands seem to align with the preconditions of TPLF, but there is nothing that has been provided to the Ethiopian government.
Well, whenever you have sanctions imposed, unfortunately, you're going to have a situation where the burden of sanctions falls on the existing government in charge, just because they are in charge and they're responsible for more things. When you have a group, in this case a rebel group, that is opposed to the government, they're in charge of much less. Now, I think it's a perfectly legitimate point to make that the executive order itself does not call for the retreat, as it were, of TPLF forces or Tigrayan defense forces from Amhara and Afar region. That is, I think, a valid point. But beyond that, I don't know what else the U.S. government can require of the Tigrayan forces that would not, in effect, cause them to capitulate to the Ethiopian government position, and therefore there would be no reason for negotiations.
So in an ideal condition, as you said, the Prime Minister Abiy has rejected the demand. But if we were to go back and look at the U.S. plan, what is exactly expected of the negotiated settlement? Is the negotiation about territorial gains, or is it about changes to the constitution, or throwing out the elections that were just held in Ethiopia, or form a transitional government? What exactly is the intended goal of what is the U.S. hoping for from the negotiated settlement and from the negotiations?
My reading of the executive order is that it is none of that. It is essentially a request that negotiations begin between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan forces, or the TPLF, that will eventually lead, ideally, to a ceasefire and eventually to some sort of negotiated solution between those parties. It also is a request that humanitarian relief organizations be given unfettered access to northern Ethiopia. They call it northern Ethiopia. In this case, it's largely Tigray, but conceivably it could refer to parts of Amhara and Afar region also. And those are the two things that are being called for as I read the executive order.
Mm-hmm. When we look at the U.S. statements, particularly from USAID Director Samantha Powers and the UN representative at the United Nations, even some of the State Department people, it's always disrespect to Ethiopia, Ethiopian history, the Ethiopian election and the vote of Ethiopians. There is no sympathy for the Ethiopian case. I mean, it may not be intended, but if we look at the Samantha Powers, everything about Ethiopia is negative, but she never even acknowledges that TPLF has been hindering the delivery of aid because they do not return the trucks. So there is a mistrust, not only in the political establishment of Ethiopia, but also among Ethiopian Americans. Do you think this is a delivery problem, or it's related to a long relationship between the previous TPLF government and these people in power?
Issue, and there may very well be some legitimate complaints in this regard, where it does come across as being a one-sided approach. I don't think that it has to do with the fact that up until 2018, the TPLF was the leading power in the EPRDF, which was from 1991 until 2018 the government of Ethiopia, and was accepted as such by the international community, including the United States. So I really do think that to the extent there appears to be a one-sidedness to this, it's a delivery issue. And it also relates to the fact that whenever you deal with sanctions, I don't care what country you're talking about or what issue you're talking about, it's always the existing government that appears to bear the brunt of the sanctions because they're in charge of so much more than the rebel group is.
So, I mean, for many Ethiopians, the U.S. has not provided a straight answer to the election. I don't know if I know you don't speak for the U.S. government, but is this your understanding? The U.S. recognizes the elections as legitimate? I mean, I know we can debate whether it's fair or perfect. I know that. But compared to TPLF elections, it is even better. Has the U.S. accepted the next government to be duly elected?
It has. Normally, the United States doesn't declare after elections are over in any country that we now continue to recognize this government. They don't comment on it. If the elections are particularly bad in the view of the United States, they will normally say something and comment that we're very displeased with these elections. but they continue to work with the government that was elected. As you know, in Ethiopia, there were numerous elections that were very lacking in meaning. The only one, perhaps, that was a meaningful election was 2005. And the United States accepted the outcome, but was fairly critical in subsequent years about the nature of many of those elections in its annual human rights report, for example.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is from the executive order is President Biden states an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security and foreign policy of the United States. What exactly is the national interest of the United States in Ethiopia? Is this a little bit exaggeration, or Ethiopia is particularly important?
Well, I was intrigued by that line also, and when I first read the executive order, I was very struck by it. It may be that in order to issue an executive order like this, you have to connect it to the national security of the United States. That may be effectively a requirement of an executive order. I'm only guessing on this. I don't know for a fact that that is the case. But I have no other explanation than that. It struck me as being unusual, but I don't read all of these executive orders that come out from around the world. It might be useful at some point to look at other executive orders to see if they have a similar line in them in the introduction. But you're right; it is a striking line.
Mm-hmm. I will just mention that we tried to reach to the State Department for an interview opportunity. Ethiopian Americans voted for the Democrats and President Biden, and we have repeatedly reached out to the State Department for interviews. They don't answer our question. Of course, there are coming elections that could change the power in the Senate and the House. Ethiopian will be organizing. So, I mean, as you know, just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration withdrew from Afghanistan because national security is not that much affected. So when I read it, I was a little surprised. Do you think this claim will lead to further actions, including military action against Ethiopia?
No, it will not lead to military actions against Ethiopia. I don't think anyone in the U.S. government has ever even hinted at that. If there's one thing I'm fairly certain of, is that sentence is not a reference to potential future military action. I think the United States has had its fill of military actions in various parts of the world in the last couple of decades, and it certainly is not interested in another one in Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm. I want to revisit one point we already talked about. One of the things, you have served in Sudan, in Ethiopia, you have a very extensive experience in the foreign service. Some of the people that are involved in the diplomacy today are much more interested in ideology rather than statecraft, at least I will call it that. So do you think maybe if diplomats who are more interested in negotiation, in diplomacy, as opposed to threats and sanctions, and are involved, as you know, Ethiopian psyche does not respond well to threats. Do you think there is any room for the State Department to be more respectful to Ethiopians and to communicate with Ethiopians through public communication and individually to reach some sort of a constructive dialogue?
Well, of course, keep in mind that this is a two-way street when it comes to being respectful of each other. And I think arguably you could look at some things that have been said from the Ethiopian side that the United States would be troubled by. But I think it is important to be respectful on both sides of the issue. And there probably are some occasions where the United States can be legitimately criticized for not being sufficiently respectful. I don't think that there has been any significant change over time from the era that I was serving in Africa, and particularly in Ethiopia, and what is going on today. Some of the people who are engaged today were engaged during that time frame. Admittedly, most of them were younger and more junior. But you have, for example, Ambassador Feltman, who is the U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, who has been around for a long time and is certainly steeped in the importance of negotiation and being respectful. I don't think that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he has ever said anything publicly that Ethiopians would find disrespectful. If others have done so, it's unfortunate. And that's the kind of thing that should be avoided and falls in the category of unnecessary mistakes.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to the second demand, that is unfettered access, humanitarian access, delivery to Tigray and other parts of Ethiopia. So here we have conflicting reports. Goes back to the trust. I went back and looked at the tweets from Samantha Powers and also her press releases, USAID. And I will mention that we welcome USAID to come and explain their positions. We will try, but it is a one-way street, as I said. It is as if the government intentionally wants to starve Tigray. And I think for Ethiopians like me, our history, our religious background does not allow us that. There are checks that delayed it. There were 7 checks. It has been reduced to 2. And there are some bureaucratic delays. But to make statements such as intentionally starving for a government official, as I said, Ambassador Rice, who is in the White House, I know she's not involved in foreign policy, but she has been partisan to TPLF over 27 years, very close ties with Meles Zenawi. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in terms of unfettered access, we all want unfettered access for those in need. But the U.S. should also acknowledge that TPLF is hindering access. And as I said, most of 80% of the trucks have not been returned back. And also USAID aid centers have been looted by TPLF. USAID in Washington, D.C. never addresses this. So I don't know if you can tell us anything about this. How can we create common ground so that we can deliver food to those who are in need?
This is an area where, one, I'll make a caveat in terms of what I know or don't know about the situation. I have not been to Tigray in a number of years. I haven't been to Ethiopia since 2019. So I'm not on the ground. I'm not personally in a position to verify which of this information is accurate and which is inaccurate. I've seen the conflicting reports. I do tend to accept more readily the information that I see coming from the humanitarian relief organizations, as opposed to that which comes from either the government of Ethiopia or from the Tigrayan sources. They, in my view, are both biased on this issue, and I am reluctant to accept at face value what they say when it comes to access in Tigray. When the international relief organizations are speaking, I'm sure they get it wrong sometimes. I don't think they get it wrong intentionally. But those reports have been pretty overwhelmingly critical of the government position on inability to access much of Tigray, and also concerning the the problems that have been encountered by the relief organizations in Tigray are normally laid at the feet of the central government. That has weighed my own personal view on this. So there is a problem here about whose information is correct. As I say, I'm not in a position to personally judge it because I'm not there. But I would be careful, I guess, in terms of accepting information coming from either the Tigrayan side or the central government side when it comes to humanitarian access.
Okay. Another question I want to ask you is, in the executive order, to my recollection, for the first time in American State Department press releases, the Amhara regional government has been mentioned. Is there any implication in this? Is this a way of saying that the Amhara regional government is not part of the federal government? Well, why was it needed to specify the Amhara regional government?
I doubt very much that it has any connection with that. I think the only explanation I have for including it is the role of the Amhara regional or irregular forces. I think that probably would have sufficed just to say that and not include the Amhara regional government. But I suspect that's why the Amhara regional government was included in it. I have no other explanation for it.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to tell you something that is talked about a lot in the Ethiopian community. The U.S. government, one of their initial positions, I think still their position is what they call West Tigray has to be returned to TPLF. I think having worked in Ethiopia, you know that Walqayit and Raya and Tagade are contested areas for a long time. Not only that, Ethiopians are trying to transition away from ethnic federalism. So there is position that it can arbitrate, it can reward territory to one group, proves that it is not a neutral body. And the Amhara government was mentioned exactly because of that. Would you care to comment on this?
Again, I can only guess at what is going on here, but first, I don't recall that anyone in the U.S. government said explicitly that Western Tigray must be returned as part of Tigray. I don't think that has ever been stated in quite that way. I think the assumption that the U.S. government has made is that all of this needs to be negotiated between the Tigrayan authorities and the central government during these negotiations. And if there are parts of Western Tigray that the central government believes should be considered as part of Amhara region, that's up for discussion. But I don't think they've ever said it must be returned to TPLF responsibility or authority.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back and look at it, but they did say that. I want to go to the next point. One point I want to raise is another very important point. As you know, some Ethiopians have been against ethnic federalism for a long time. Actually, many Ethiopians believe the root cause of this war is ethnic federalism. So when the U.S. gets involved in our politics, and some of the position it takes seems to suggest go back to the status quo before TPLF lost power, and hence ethnic federalism. As we know, America is built on individual rights. Why wouldn't the U.S. foreign policy reflect the principles of American democracy, individual rights, and advocate for the amendment of the Constitution to be based on individual rights?
Again, I think too many Ethiopians are reading too much into what the U.S. has not said or done. Again, I'm not aware of any instance where the United States has said we support ethnic federalism in Ethiopia and that one must return to that. I think this is something that some Ethiopians are implying on the basis of the executive order and other statements that the United States has made, but it has never said anything that explicit. And to the best of my knowledge, that's not the position of the U.S. government to insist upon the implementation of ethnic federalism.
I want to go to the next point. One of the contested points, and it's in the executive order, is the issue of the Eritrean forces. So as we all know, Eritrean forces have participated in the war on the side of Ethiopia. I want to ask you one maybe legal or diplomatic question. Can a sovereign state invite another country to send its army?
It can. I think in the case of Ethiopia, inviting Eritrea into Ethiopia to support central government forces is probably about the most hypocritical invitation that I can recall in recent history, however. I was in Ethiopia in 1998 when the war broke out in Badame between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And for a couple of decades, Eritrea was considered to be an enemy of Ethiopia. Now, all of a sudden, it's Ethiopia's best friend. I think that they have every right, Ethiopia has every right to invite Eritrea in. But I also think it's one of the most hypocritical moves I've ever seen.
No, I agree. Hypocritical, I agree. But legally, a state, a sovereign nation can invite another country, and the U.S. has been invited to many countries. So why is the U.S. So concerned about that if Ethiopia, as a sovereign nation, invites another country?
No, it's not the fact that the Eritreans were invited in. It's what the Eritrean forces did after they arrived in Tigray, where they obliterated a couple of Eritrean refugee camps. And according to reports, I can't verify it because I'm not on the ground there, took back some of the Eritreans forcefully into Eritrea, and where allegedly, and again, I can't verify the reports, the Eritrean forces were involved in some of the worst atrocities in Tigray. That is what I think the U.S. is complaining about. It's not the fact that Eritrea invited, or that Ethiopia invited Eritrean forces into the country.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the executive order. As you said, it's unlikely that this will lead to solution. So what do you expect next? What would be your advice if President Biden asked you for next steps? And what will be your advice if Prime Minister Abiy asked you for your advice?
Well, first, I don't expect to hear from either one of them, so it's a moot point. Nevertheless, if I were Prime Minister Abiy, I would seriously consider the idea of trying to undertake some kind of negotiation with the Tigrayan forces to bring this whole thing to a halt. I don't think that a military victory is possible by either side. I don't know what the objective of the TPLF is, whether the goal is to briefly go into Amhara and Afar regions and then pull back. I know that they would certainly like to regain what they call Western Tigray, but I don't know what their end game is. The end game of the central government seems to be to eliminate the Tigrayan Defense Forces and the TPLF, to literally wipe it out. And that's where you're never going to have a victory one way or the other. It's just going to be a stalemate with a lot more people on both sides being harmed. So I think that some kind of negotiation, getting some kind of negotiation underway, is the way forward. On the U.S. side, I would suggest that let's wait and see a little while longer. What will the response be from both the TPLF and from the Addis Ababa side? Will the TPLF or the Tigrayan Defense Forces pull back into Tigray? And that would be a positive move if they would do that. And likewise, if if the Ethiopian government were to begin some kind of negotiation, however it is done, it can be done quietly behind the scenes without the public even knowing about it. And for all I know, maybe it's going on. But something along those lines, I think, would be send a very good signal to a country like the United States and probably to other European countries.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of questions on that point. One is precedence. If a regional government attacks a federal army and it is rewarded with recognition and, I don't know, share of power or whatever it is, what precedence, particularly in a country where the politics is centered on ethnicity and identity, what precedence would that create for Ethiopia?
Well, I mean, you're asking a hypothetical question that I don't know as though I have the answer to. I guess my response would be that rather than try to answer the question, because I don't have a good response to it, is what is the alternative? Is the alternative a continuation of conflict until somebody falls, someone is defeated, which I don't see happening anytime in the foreseeable future? And if that is the alternative, it doesn't look very good to me as an alternative.
Mm-hmm. So I want to end our conversation. If I forgot something, you are welcome to add it, and I'm very grateful for you coming. I want to really concentrate one thing. As you know, hundreds of thousands of people like me have migrated to the United States, made very successful livings. We have families, kids, American-born kids, and we love America dearly. So and as I said, we voted overwhelmingly for President Biden and the Democrats. Now there seem to be, whether intentionally or unintentionally, a lack of trust between the Ethiopian diaspora and the people in power, the Democrats particularly. So what can we Ethiopians, what would you suggest Ethiopians do to overcome this mistrust and work together to bring peace to Ethiopia?
Well, on the one hand, it really is important to try to get the facts on what is happening on the ground in Ethiopia. I think there are cases, as we have discussed today, where we do have some disagreement as to who did what to whom. And I see a lot of the social media communications from the Ethiopian diaspora. And I must be very frank with you. I sometimes just have to shake my head and say, where are they getting this information? It certainly does not accord with what I understand to be the case. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything I see is accurate either. I'm sure I see some misinformation, but I think I'm able to sort out most of that, which is totally wrong. So getting the facts and having a basis of understanding on both the Ethiopian diaspora side and the U.S. government side, I think, is very important. I'm sure the U.S. government gets it wrong from time to time. But they do have access to a lot of information. It's not as though, as I sometimes see in the diaspora communications, that everything the U.S. government says or does is based on a complete misunderstanding as to what is happening in Ethiopia. I mean, there are people there on the ground. We do have some access. I assume we even have people that go into Tigray occasionally. And you certainly have access to all of the international community that is in Tigray. So the U.S. is trying to compile the situation, the facts of the situation as best it can. And I would simply ask that the diaspora community try to do the same thing. As far as what the diaspora community might do in the United States, I think it's important that it stay in contact with persons on both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats. Express your point of view, hopefully based on facts, not rumors, and make those points forcefully known. What's interesting to me is that on the Ethiopian issue, it seems that there is a fair amount of support from the Republican side for the executive order, for example. There aren't that many members of Congress who follow Ethiopia at all, but those who do, I have seen some measure of support for it. So I think it's important to understand where everyone is coming from on both sides of the political aisle in the United States also.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and I really appreciate for you coming. You're welcome to add anything if I forgot, and I hope you will join us another time and we can review or we can assess where we are. Thank you very much. If you have other things you want to say, you are welcome to.
Well, no, I would only, if I could repeat just two brief points, and one, thank you. I always appreciate the interviews with you, Ghazal, because they are respectful. It would be very easy to be contentious and ask nasty questions that I am not really in a position to answer, since I am not part of the U.S. government. But you've asked respectful questions. I don't agree with everything that you have concluded on this point, but that's beside the point. We are entitled to have different points of view on some of the facts of the situation. The only other thing I would like to repeat is, one, some of these issues I don't have answers for because I'm not on the ground. I'm not personally observing these things. And it's very hard for anyone, for me or for someone in the Ethiopian diaspora, to know definitively what is happening in some of these areas where there just isn't very good information. I realize that the diaspora has access to friends and relatives that they communicate with by social media and telephone, etc. But even that doesn't necessarily lead to facts. There can be a lot of rumors that gets into those communications. And then lastly, I, of course, don't speak for the U.S. government, and I may end up irritating as many people in the U.S. government as I just have in the Ethiopian diaspora.
Ambassador, I really thank you, and our conversation is hopefully useful for everybody. Until next time, thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
This has been Insight from Ethiopian Television Network in Washington, D.C. We discussed the current Ethiopian-American relationship with Ambassador David Shinn. Ambassador David Shinn was an ambassador in Ethiopia, the U.S. ambassador in Ethiopia, and also he was a high-level diplomat in Sudan. I hope you enjoyed our program. Until next time, bye.